welcome to Vintage Movie Time. I am George, and today we're taking a look at a cool film. It is The Incredible Shrinking Man from 1957. This one was directed by Jack Arnold. The film stars Grant Williams and April Kent, and it's based on the novel by Richard Matheson. That's right, we are keeping the Richard Matheson love going today. We already covered the movie The Last Man on Earth, which was based on his book, I Am Legend. And now we are doing this one, because Richard Matheson is awesome. Okay, so the plot about this is pretty straightforward. The title says a lot. So it's about this guy, his name is Scott Carey. One day, him and his wife are on vacation. They're out on this boat, and he's on deck by himself, and this radioactive cloud comes out of nowhere and gets covered all over him, and he gets particles of radiation on him. And this is the thing, this catalyst, that's going to start him in this shrinking process. So from there, the story progresses, and we get like several stages of shrinking. So it starts out that he's not fitting in his clothes. His clothes are loose, like he's losing weight. Then his wedding ring falls off. And then he's a couple inches shorter than he should be. And then he's way shorter than he should be. He's only like a couple feet tall. And it goes on and on until he's like 2 inches tall. So that's the progression of his shrinking, and it happens over time. It happens over like a couple weeks or a couple months. Later in the story, as he's coping with the shrinking and he gets super small, he ends up falling into his basement. They're the family cat, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the video, but the family cat chases him around the house, and he ends up in the basement, and he falls into this box of rags, and the door shuts, and he's like locked down in the basement, and he's too small to climb his way back up. And so then his wife comes home and sees the cat and concludes that the cat ate him and he's dead. And so no one knows that he's actually in the basement and needs help. And when he's in the basement, he has to do the things he can try to do to survive. He's looking for food, and then there's a spider running around coming after him. And he's got to try to work with big objects that are hard for him to navigate, like a mouse trap or things like that. So that's the basic premise of the movie. That's what we got here, and it works. It's really good for an adventure story. So as I mentioned before, this is based on the book by Richard Matheson. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time comparing the film to the book. I actually did a review of the book a while back, and it's here on my YouTube channel, so if you'd like to get my thoughts on how the book is, you can just watch that video, and I talk extensively about that. But I will say that the book really gets into the idea of the male ego, and as Scott is shrinking, it's like a treatise on how stature and the loss of it can be emasculating. And the book gets really deep into that and the psychology of that. The film, it touches on these elements a little bit, especially at the beginning, like the first half. There are scenes where you can see he's kind of doing the woe is me thing, and there's a lot of voiceovers. So with those voiceovers, we can kind of get into Scott's head a little bit. And there's times when he's kind of losing his cool and losing his patience and that sort of thing. But really, it doesn't focus on that deep idea like the book does as much. It really is more about the adventure angle, which comes in at the second half of the story. And to me, I think the real joy to be had in watching this is for that element of it. I think that is what really makes the movie interesting. And of course, you needed that other stuff at the beginning to build to the adventure stuff in the basement. But I think really the strength of the film is the spectacle and the effects and the idea that this guy's fighting to survive. It's like a survival story in that way. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to do is go through a couple of trivia items, and to do that, I'm going to consult the clipboard of creeps. And so let's see what the clipboard has for us today. Okay, the first thing is that Orson Welles, the great Orson Welles, he did the narration for the trailer for the film. See, he was at Universal working on the movie Touch of Evil, which came out in 1958. And they got him to do the voiceover for the trailer for this movie. So if you want to, you can actually go on YouTube and search Incredible Shrinking Man trailer and watch it. and the narration is Orson Welles. So I think that's pretty good. That's pretty neat. Okay, so the next item I think is really cool I wanted to talk about. So Richard Matheson actually wrote a film treatment for a sequel titled The Fantastic Shrinking Girl. Pretty neat. And so this story would have been about Scott's wife, Louise, and she would have started shrinking, and she would have eventually shrunk all the way down to the microscopic microverse where Scott has been shrinking to, and meet up with him again. And then from there, they would have started growing again. And then they were both going to end up back in the same basement in their house from this film, and they were going to have to battle a rat. And that was going to be the plot of the sequel. And it never got off the ground. It was never produced. So think about that for a moment. I'm going to ask you, Hollywood, why not make that movie? I think it would be cool. I mean, you got a treatment, you got something written by the great Richard Matheson. Richard Matheson has consistently put out great work. Stephen King is a fan. And you got this material. Why not make this movie? But I'm saying make it in the vein of this original. Don't use CGI for the rat. Use an actual trained rat. Don't use green screen. Bring in big props. Build a big mousetrap. Give them a big matchstick. Give them things like that to interact with. Physical things. And make it in the vein of this film. I think it would be good. Why not? Let's make that happen. The next thing I'd like to talk about is a segment that I do just for fun. I like these films, so don't be mad at me, but I always think it's fun to point out silly things. And so I'm going to do that in a segment that I call Silly Stuff. Okay, so this week's entry into Silly Stuff, it's got to do with the whole thing with the cat. I'm sorry, but that part of the film is a little bit silly, and here's why. Like I said before, he's been shrinking for weeks and months, and it's been a gradual process. He's not like Ant-Man and just goes in a second. So they've had time to prepare for the idea that he's going to eventually be big enough to fit in a dollhouse. Why do they keep the cat around? Their solution was to put the cat outside. Okay, so all right now, Fluffy, you're going to go live outside now because Scott is big enough to fit in a dollhouse. So the cat eventually sneaks its way back in. Well, of course it's going to do that. It's a cat. It doesn't want to live outside. Its home is inside, and now you're making it live out. So as soon as the door is open a crack, the cat sneaks in, and it chases Scott around the house. Well, what do you think was going to happen? Now think about it. Anybody that owns a cat, they know that cats chase little things around like gangbusters. They are obsessed with that. So the smart thing to have done would have been, way before Scott got to be the size of a figure that could fit in a dollhouse, would have been to send it to go live with Aunt Tilly or something. Okay, so, you know, that part of it was a little silly. I understand they had to have the cat to have the device needed to get Scott into the basement, but I wanted a little bit more meat on the bone than that. I wanted a better explanation. Maybe it was a stray that they weren't expecting to come into the house, or maybe it was somebody was bringing the cat by for one last visit and it got out of its cage. Something a little bit more than that would have helped in that situation, I think. But yeah, if you're this big, probably not a good idea to keep your cat. Alright, that brings me to my final thoughts, and I like this film. It's a fun, enjoyable movie to watch. It's good sci-fi. It's short. It's only like an hour and 20 minutes. It comes in under the hour and a half mark. I do think, like I said before, that the strength of the film lies mostly in its second half. When Scott gets into the basement and he's fighting the spider and he's fighting the elements and he's doing whatever he can do to survive and try to better his situation, that's where the real enjoyment and adventure and excitement in the story comes out. So if you decide to watch this, definitely hang in for the second half, because it really builds up to some good old school sci-fi in that part of the film. Okay, again, the film is Incredible Shrinking Man from 1957. Thanks again for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And until the next time, have a good one.